mean, she leaves acting. She leaves Hollywood. She's gone. Some people might say that's sad. Others might say, well, she saved her own life.
Imagine walking away from fame at the very height of your career. Imagine leaving millions of fans, blockbuster films, and the glimmering lights of Hollywood, and never looking back. For decades, people have wondered, why did Evelyn Hart, one of the brightest stars of the early 90s, suddenly vanish? No goodbye tour, no farewell interview, just silence. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said scandal, others whispered heartbreak. But the truth, the real reason she walked away, remained buried for 31 years. Until now, the glossy surface of Hollywood step into Evelyn's hidden world and finally reveal the choices that cost her everything, yet gave her back her life. This is not just the story of a vanished star. It's the story of freedom, sacrifice, and the price of survival in an industry built on illusion. They called her a discovery, an impossible, incandescent, find in a world that trafficked in fame the way weather trafficked in storms. Evelyn Hart grew up where the map thinned, a coastal town where gulls gnawed at the early morning, and the cinema was a single-screen theater with red curtains and a scratchy projector. She learned to perform to an audience of fishermen and waitresses, to make people look up from their coffee and forget that the tide had come in. When a casting director dropped into town for lunch at the Harbor Cafe, Evelyn was folding napkins behind the counter. A photograph later, an image of wide eyes and a hesitant smile, found its way to a studio desk. Soon enough, an audition. Then a role. Then a face on a bus shelter that the whole city seemed to know her rise was not polite. It was white-hot and disorienting. One moment she was a local girl selling oranges on the pier. The next, she was on the cover of glossy magazines. A studio photograph sculpted by light and careful direction. The late 1980s and early 1990s had a hunger for faces that said everything without speaking. Innocence laced with an inner engine. Evelyn had it. Directors cut for her. She learned the language of the set in days, hitting marks with a smile. That masked exhaustion, saying lines written by committees and somehow making them sound intimate. There is always a price to immediacy. The studio system wrapped around her like a cloak, stylists who advised the angles of her jaw, publicists who rephrased her laughter, managers whose calendars resembled military timetables. Interviews wove mythic narratives about the girl who'd come from nowhere. Fans attached themselves to those narratives. They loved the idea of Evelyn Hart more than the woman who slept 3 hours between shoots and cried once at night, thinking about a mother who had sold home-baked pies to support a family. And yet, for all the lights, Evelyn's performance was electric. She could hold a frame in silence and make a pause feel like confession. Her third film, an intimate drama about a woman learning to leave, sank into the public conscience. Critics lined up metaphors, awards committees whispered. Her name sold. Perfume, tickets, magazine covers. Old friends from the small town called occasionally, caught between pride and incredulity. Evelyn answered with a voice that tried not to tremble. By the time the cameras panned one final time for a given season, she had already begun to catalog the demands of this life. The bright path out of town had widened into a highway with no shoulder. She had traded anonymity for applause. What she had not yet reckoned with was how applause could slide into expectation. How a career that began with invitation could become a ledger written in someone else's ink. The first chapter of her public life reads like a fairy tale: discovery, ascent, coronation. But fairy tales often forget the price of the lamp. Someone always pays. Glamour is the name the press gave the outer skin. Insiders called it a currency, to be spent and rationed. Fame arrived for Evelyn with a ledger, obligations inked into calendars, relationships cataloged as PR opportunities, evenings devoted to parties where laughter floated over conversations carefully steered by handlers. When the world wants you, it rarely wants the messy, ragged human underneath. It wants the image, an extractable, sellable essence dot on the glossy surface. Evelyn's life checked all the boxes. The late-night talk show smiles, the charity gala, photographs, the awkward kisses for tabloids. She was photographed with movie stars whose papered reputations made her seem like an apprentice, and photographed again with dignitaries who were careful not to be seen smiling too broadly. Her image was sharpened by teams, stylists, writers, marketing strategists whose job was to ensure she remained a brand. But commodification is eating at the inside. Contracts contained lines about image and availability. Marketing campaigns created narratives that began to substitute for memory. People around her were rarely neutral because the ecosystem rewarded the calibrated personality. When Evelyn asked for nuance, when she pushed to play characters who were messy and complicated, the response could be subtle and severe. Fewer offers, hesitancy in executive halls, an editorial committee that murmured about audience readiness. Relationships, too, were a controlled currency. Lovers came with clauses of their own, jealousy and ambition often disguised as passion. A partner's career could be simultaneous support and threat. Trinkets of sincerity, late-night phone calls, a hand at a premiere were often entangled with career ambitions. The paparazzi were always waiting for the moment to turn a fight into a headline. Private errors became public spectacle. Sincerity itself grew suspect in a world that assumed everything was performance. Evelyn developed private rituals to survive, a drawer of unsent letters, photographs of a childhood not meant for magazine spreads, a practice of speaking to herself in the mirror to remember the voice before the stage. She kept friends from home close. Their anger at her absence sometimes made the cost of fame more concrete than the applause. The gulf between myth and person widened. Over time, she realized the price of stardom was not only sacrifice, it was the slow erosion of autonomy, the leasing of parts of herself to market demands. The choice to perform on-screen began to bleed into obligations off-stage, and Evelyn felt the shape of a life that asked her to be less herself. Contracts in Hollywood can feel like arcane spells, clauses, riders, and fine print that bend life toward profitability. For Evelyn, the legal documents that had once felt like ladders to success became bars. Standard stipulations, non-disparagement, exclusivity, morality clauses were stitched into deals with the precision of a seamstress, but their effect was often that of a caged young inexperienced, and dazzled by possibility, she signed with trust and haste. Studio lawyers framed the agreements as protection. Image rights managed, endorsements coordinated, promotions scheduled. The reality was messier. Those same papers could limit artistic control, tether time with late-night obligations, and bring financial penalties for unapproved absences. Want a break? There were fees. Speak out? There were consequences. The legal scaffolding was both an economic apparatus and a cultural one. The system rewarded compliance. There was the carrot, marquee roles, and the stick, career limbo. Agents and managers became gatekeepers who could root or deny opportunity. Evelyn watched a single casting director's frown ripple through rooms. An offhand comment could cascade into vanished opportunities. In such an ecosystem, silence is often survival. Contracts form the survival toolkit inside the cage, choices frayed. Friendships were filtered through favors, romantic relationships, through usefulness, and creative risks were pruned to marketability. Producers and executives favored predictability. True artistic risk made them nervous. When Evelyn pushed for nuance, scripting a character richer than the love interest or wistful heroine, it was sometimes labeled as troublemaking. Offers cooled, invitations to projects thinned. Still, Evelyn tried. She argued for depth, for authenticity, for women on screen who were allowed to be complicated. Her insistence read variously as courage, as diva behavior, and as a liability. The studio calculus tended to prioritize reliability over unpredictability, and reliability often meant the industry defined who you were allowed to be. The legal bonds didn't only control her performances, they reached into rest, recovery, and medical care. Therapy appointments were squeezed into 2-hour windows between shoots. Medication came in discreet packages, and publicity calendars left no room for grief. The deeper truth the contracts revealed was cultural. The industry's paperwork codified norms that expected artists to endure. It was an architecture of assent, papered over power. Once Evelyn recognized the depth of entrapment, the path out narrowed. Buyout clauses, legal fees, and the reality that leaving was not merely emotional, but financial and bureaucratic. The cage was built one clause at a time, and understanding its construction was the first step to dismantling it. Every public life carries private chapters, pages no magazine can place under glass. Evelyn's secret was not a single sensational scandal. It was a tethered set of wounds stitched into the fabric of her life. When a young woman relocates to Hollywood with a suitcase and talent, she learns quickly which doors open and which open only on someone else's terms. Some doors closed softly with smiles, and those slams left marks. There were incidents behind closed trailer doors and in after-parties where smoke and music blurred boundaries. Deals were made with handshakes in rooms where the floor felt unfamiliar. Some nights were consensual and messy and human. Other nights left a residual tremor, a memory that woke her at odd hours. Fear did not always arrive as terror. Sometimes it came as a small, persistent ache that instructed her to be quieter, to say less, to acquiesce. Evelyn kept her ledger hidden from public view. She feared reprisal, of career and credibility, and the endemic disbelief that often greeted women who spoke of harm. The industry, built to protect its own, was not structured to hold those stories. So she learned to translate pain into performance, pouring what could not be named into roles that required her to house and then release emotion. Art became both shelter and confessional. The camera, paradoxically, became a witness when human ears would not. Silence was also strategy. Speaking out could mean immediate collapse of earning potential in a system that punished inconvenient truths. So for years, she chose the bitter calculus. Silence now to preserve a platform she might later use to speak with agency. That decision felt like barter. Immediate peace for long-term authority. She kept that bargain by force of will. But secrets have gravity. They leak through jokes in green rooms, offhand remarks in interviews, and the way a hand lingers in a photograph. People began to notice if they watched closely. Evelyn learned to deflect, to redirect conversations, to appear unbroken. The cost of that constant performance was steep. Insomnia, flaring tempers, a sense of detachment from a life she performed nightly. She fed the secret with silence, hoping the appetite would lessen. It did not. Instead, the secret matured, patient and alive, until the day she would weigh the price of continued silence against the freedom of telling. Not all stories of disappearance are cinematic in the way tabloids imagine. Evelyn's departure was not a dramatic airport sprint or a fistfight in public. It was a deliberately staged exodus disguised as an ordinary evening. The last photograph the press loved, a tailored coat, a soft smile, cigarette between gloved fingers, was a sheet draped over a plan executed with precision. On an autumn night in 1994, she left a wrap party early. She had mastered the choreography of exits. A quick embrace, a wave caught on the periphery of a flash, a face turned only, enough to be recognized. That night she packed light, a duffel, a sweater that belonged to her mother, a stack of unsent letters. She took a flight to a city that meant nothing to most in her orbit and everything to her. She walked out with a purpose that was ordinary, in its finality, to return to a life that had room for breathing. Moments before the leaving, time read differently. Details sharpened, the taste of wine, the cadence of laughter, a voicemail from an old friend who steadied her voice. She opened an envelope, read a note she'd written herself months before, and in that folded page recognized the woman she had been. Evelyn's exit was planned. Legal contingencies were in place, buyout clauses negotiated with discreet counsel, funds tucked away. She did not flee in chaos. She unspooled obligations in quiet legal steps. The plan was to avoid the rupture tabloids' feast on Dot. When the public realized she had left, speculation erupted. Some invented betrayal and worse. Others romanticized the departure as a tragic retreat. But the truth was quieter, a deliberate reclamation of privacy. Leaving meant immediate losses, income interruptions, a cooling of Hollywood friendships, the rumor mill shifting into overdrive, but it offered a currency she had never had before, time not scheduled by someone else. She cooked at noon, walked. Streets without cameras answered calls off the record. The cost of leaving was real. It required social currency and quiet legal maneuvering. For Evelyn, it also meant stepping off the public ladder at a time when re-entry was never guaranteed. Yet the alternative, remaining compromised, felt like a slow erasure. In anonymity, she found slow healing, therapy without tabloid timing, nights without flashes, the gradual reassembly of a self not curated by PR teams. The departure became a statement that a life could be deliberately paused and rebuilt on different terms. When a star halts participation without explanation, rumor behaves as if employed, efficient, imaginative, and relentless. The vacuum Evelyn left was quickly filled with noise. Tabloids invented narratives, secret marriages, sudden addiction, a spiritual retreat, a fugitive romance. Every theory found believers and denials. In absence of fact, rumor accrues rhetorical authority. Her disappearance morphed into a story that then fed itself. Pundits combed through her last interviews for hidden meaning. Casual acquaintances were repositioned as key informants. People who had offered her a ride to set were suddenly sources for exclusive sightings. Fans started message board vigils. Photographers chased phantom sightings. Gossip columnists sold softened portraits of someone who had run. For Evelyn, the public metamorphosis was an echo chamber giving back distorted shapes of her life. False leads wore varied faces. Some were malicious attempts to monetize absence. Others were misremembered slivers from those who had been close. Each rumor grew into a larger ghost story the more it was retold. Her family received letters. Former agents fielded frantic calls. The industry watched, sometimes indulgently, as the market romanticized her absence into brand value. For many, rumor hardened into truth. People prefer a tidy story, an explanation, over the thorny moral complexity of someone choosing withdrawal. Rumor simplifies, truth complicates. In the public imagination, it was easier to hold on to the myth of a tragic downfall than to accept the slippery, pragmatic reality where a woman chooses privacy. From the margin, Evelyn saw this construct and resisted the urge to respond. To refute would be to re-enter a game she had left. To ignore allowed fiction to ossify. She cultivated an ethic of non-response that required patience she did not always possess. The rumor machine kept spinning, but with every year of silence, the more elaborate stories lost their fuel. In time, a careful, chosen disclosure would be the only thing that could replace invented narratives with verified context. Decades can be good at burying things until someone decides to dig. The story that finally reopened Evelyn's life, too. Public view began with a plain package, a brown envelope that arrived at a small legal office on a rainy Monday. Inside were transcripts, photos, and a stack of letters written in a hand people would later recognize. The note pinned to the parcel read simply, "Hold until the time is right." What emerged from that folder was not a tabloid tell-all, but a slow-phase revelation. The letters detailed decisions made under pressure, choices declined in principle, and moments where appearances had been traded for safety. They pointed to systemic patterns, how boundaries were redrawn in private meetings, how scripts changed after dinner conversations, how casual coercion could be normalized with a smile. The documents were bureaucratic, ordinary, and therefore damning. Redlined contracts, emails asking for rewrites, memos that indicated fear of reputational risk. Her lawyer issued a careful statement. Evelyn had chosen privacy for decades. She now chose to speak with agency. The transcripts and photos provided context more than spectacle. Conversations with executives and colleagues suggested a culture of compromise. Producers described fearing a box office risk, while others framed decisions as protecting marketability. The absence of lurid evidence did not render the story less true. Its timidity was its point. Most coercion is too small or bureaucratic to make immediate headlines, but still life-altering. The public reaction was mixed. Vindication for some, skepticism for others, and a broad cultural conversation about how industries protect themselves. Evelyn's voice, when she finally agreed to a controlled interview, was steadier than many expected, clear, measured, unembittered, but firm. She did not rage for revenge. She laid out specific asks: contractual reform, independent ombuds channels, protections for those who disclose harm. Rather than a crusade, the revelation was an invitation. It reframed her not as a vanished actress, but as a living witness, with a platform for change. The industry response ranged from immediate statements of support to defensive denials. The slow work of policy conversation began. But the most important shift was personal. Evelyn reclaimed the narrative of her life. Her testimony offered language and permission to others who had been silenced, an act of courage that refused to dramatize pain while insisting on reform. When a public life recedes, a private one grows in the shadows it leaves. Evelyn's return to speech was not a comeback tour. It was an invitation. In the years after disclosure, she built practical institutions, a foundation offering legal aid and counseling for performers, a sanctuary for rest between jobs, and workshops teaching young artists the legal particulars no one had explained. When she was starting out, her days were no longer governed by call times or polishing interviews, but by the needs of others and the small domestic routines she'd missed. She mentored fledgling actors in both craft and contracts, telling stories she had held silent. She sat on panels and in closed negotiations, lobbying for contract transparency. Evelyn argued not to destroy the industry she loved, but to steward it to a place where agency mattered. There was also an emotional reclamation. She reconnected with family, revived the quiet rituals of her childhood, and learned to be seen at breakfast without makeup. Friends from those early years became anchors. The simplicity of a shared meal was more precious than any award. She walked beaches at dawn where gulls still cried and watched tides return as patient clocks. There was joy, small, weathered,